Good afternoon and welcome back to this session in our Dignity and Development Forum at the Keough School of Keough School of Global Affairs. My name is Tom Mastillo. I'm a member of the faculty here at the school, and I'd just like to remind you that this is in addition to this audience gathered here, we have a very large virtual audience and a social media presence for our event. So you can share what inspires you here today and connect with your peers and keep the conversation going online using the hashtag DignityDev. That is hashtag DignityDev. Now I'd like to welcome you to the panel with Maura Policelli. Good luck, Maura.
It's a lot of confidence in me, Tom. You're rooting for me. That means a lot. Good afternoon. I'm Maura Policelli, and I'm the Executive Director of the Keough School's Washington, D.C. office. So I have the wonderful pleasure of representing the Keough School in Washington, where we have an anchor, an office where we bring students and faculty to Washington to engage in policy-relevant conversations, bring their policy-relevant research and curriculum to Washington to engage with policymakers, experts, and advocates. Today, I have the incredible pleasure of bringing Washington to Notre Dame. This panel of experts with me and the others who will be joining us shortly, including a couple of Keough School faculty, the others are all Washington experts, policymakers, and advocates, and our wonderful guests here at Notre Dame. And while when we bring students to DC and faculty, they get a chance to soak in the politics, the power, all the passion, and sometimes the ugliness of policymaking, both U.S. policy and global policy. And our guests from Washington, they get to come here and experience not only getting outside the Beltway and coming to Middle America, but to immerse themselves in the mission of Notre Dame, which is to bring scholarship and policy into the realm of the common good, in pursuit of the common good. So it's an honor for us to be able to host them and have this conversation here on campus. So with that, we'll get started. And I have an incredible panel here to formally introduce. We are really, really fortunate to have several distinguished policy leaders with us. First, we have Ann Witkowsky, who's the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the U.S. Department of State. We have Rob Jenkins, who's the Assistant to the Administrator for the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization at the U.S. Agency for International Development. We have Mr. Jim Saenz, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counternarcotics and Stabilization Policy at the U.S. Department of Defense. And we have Lise Grande, who's the President and CEO of the U.S. Institute of Peace. So the title of this session is U.S. Peace Policy, Can America Help Fragile States Flourish? As we explore this question, we will be focusing on a specific U.S. policy, the Global Fragility Act. And the Global Fragility Act is groundbreaking and worthy of a conversation, especially here at the Keough School, because it mandates an interagency process for U.S. engagement in some of the most fragile countries and regions in the world, where complex crises such as migration, climate change, violence, and poverty converge. So as is the DC speak in a way, what we have here in terms of our government official representatives are the 3 Ds. Diplomacy is the State Department, development at USAID, and defense with the Defense Department. So over the years, and often led by the U.S. Institute of Peace, there have been efforts to bring the 3 Ds together. Can we get the 3 Ds of U.S. policy and U.S. governance to work together, especially in some very complex environments around the world? And the Global Fragility Act is the latest, and I think a very hopeful, effort to make this a reality. So these individuals, government officials here, they are directly responsible for implementing the Global Fragility Act. So it is wonderful that they're here to work with us, have some conversations even after the panel to explore how we here at the Keough School and others in academia can support their efforts. One last thing about the Global Fragility Act that we and many in policy circles are very excited about is that it's bipartisan. It moved through Congress, led by both Democrats and Republicans. Senator Coons authored it in the Senate, and Senators Lindsey Graham and Indiana's very own Todd Young were strong supporters. And in the House, it was Congressman McCall and Congressman Engel. So it's bipartisan and has a lot of potential. So we're going to dive into some questions. Hopefully I have time for more than one for each of our esteemed guests, but we'll get started with Lise Grande. And my first question, as we kind of lay the foundation for everyone around the Global Fragility Act, is if you could just give some background as to how USIP was engaged in the vision for GFA and some of the efforts that went into it that Anne and others were part of at the outset.
Thank you, and thank you to the Keough School for welcoming us. We're very pleased to be here. In 2017, the United States Institute of Peace was asked by Congress. Congress mandated us to convene a task force that looked at extremism in fragile states. At that point, if you were looking at a map at the number of countries that were affected by spreading extremism, in 21, there were probably 19 states. By 2017, there were 45. They were concentrated in the Sahel Belt and in the Middle East. At the same time, the number of incidents of violent extremism, unprovoked violence against civilians, was more than 10,000 at the time. There was a strong sense in Congress that the U.S. government was doing a lot to address extremism, but needed to do more. They reached out to the United States Institute of Peace and said, please convene a task force of eminent people to look deeply at the questions of extremism and what the U.S. should be doing to add on to what it was already doing so that it would be more effective. The reason U.S. Institute of Peace was asked to do that, we were created by Congress in 1984, and when we were created, Congress said, we want an institute that will be strictly nonpartisan. So we occupied a space within policy circles in Washington that honored the bipartisanship in U.S. foreign and security policy. We're asked to convene this task force. It was co-chaired, this is not by accident, by the two heads of the 9/11 Commission, Representative Lee Hamilton and the former governor of New Jersey, Governor Keene. There were a group of 15 very distinguished foreign and security policy leaders that were part of that task force, and then it was supported by a group of distinguished experts and scholars, some of whom are with us here today. Oh, wow, were you on that? Oh, I didn't know that.
I didn't contribute much.
What they were looking at were two interrelated sets of problems, but one of those sets of problems took precedence. So the two interrelated sets of problems were, how do you stop the spread of extremism? What kinds of policies are needed? And there was a second set of questions, which was, how does the U.S. government do better in addressing them? When I said one of those sets of questions took precedent, it was in fact the second set. How does the U.S. government work together in a way which is far more effective so that the problems that are driving this spread, this inexorable spread of extremism, are addressed more effectively? The task force came up with 3 recommendations. Number 1, you have to have a shared whole of government approach. You would think this was obvious. Of course, it's not. That was recommendation number 1. Recommendation number 2 was focus on prevention. If you think you can stop the spread of extremism through security initiatives, through military initiatives, you're only addressing part of the problem. if you really want to deal with this, address prevention. Although an obvious point now, it wasn't exactly obvious when the recommendation was made. And the third key recommendation was share the burden. So develop mechanisms where not just the U.S., but all of our allies, friendly nations, everyone concerned with this problem, contributes resources that are used in a coordinated, targeted way to address the drivers of extremism. Those were the three recommendations. They were taken up more, as you said, by a number of leading members in both the House and the Senate. That became the Global Fragility Act, which took the issue of coordination, which took the issue of a shared vision, which took the issue of burden sharing and legislated it. No longer was it contingent upon political will and the good offices of the departments of the U.S. government. It was legislated. It had to be done. There is, of course, a very significant difference to something which is voluntary and something which you must, because it's law, do. And that's now the problem set in front of all of us. It is a legislated responsibility in fragile states for the U.S. government to have a whole-of-government approach based on a shared vision, to have a pooled fund that burden shares the costs of addressing this, and that puts prevention at the center of everything we do.
Great, thank you. So, Assistant Secretary Witkowsky, you advised the task force that Ms. Grande was just mentioning, and you've held key positions in both the Defense Department and the State Department before assuming this role, which is critical to Global Fragility Act implementation. So you're the right person at the right time for this job, and no pressure, but is the momentum there? There's some other really critical roles in this implementation effort where there are some excellent people in place, but is there the momentum? What is next in the implementation of the Global Fragility Act?
Absolutely, Maura, and I should say thank you also for your wonderful hosting us here at Notre Dame's Keough Institute, and thank you specifically and your team for the terrific generosity that you have shown us since we've been here since last night. Yes, there is absolutely significant commitment to implementing this landmark bipartisan law. And I think it is notable that not only is the law bipartisan, not only was USIP a driver behind the law, but there are a number of civil society groups who were very, very instrumental in formulating the law. And it is notable, as Lee said, that it is a law. It is not a policy. And that is very helpful to we who are in government, who are now charged with carrying the law forward. There are a number of key elements to it, which I think would be useful to review. I have 7 here. I may miss 1 or 2. But I want to go over them. First is the whole of government piece. Anyone who has worked in government knows that we do function as whole of government, and we have done it for many, many years. However, all of you, especially the scholars and students in the audience, understand more than anyone where the U.S. government has fallen short in that endeavor. We do have successes. They are sometimes less well known, and those please us when we are able to come together against a common set of objectives. And I have to say, for me personally, that is what motivates some of my investment in implementing the Global Fragility Act and the strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability that we have developed from the Act. Second, the Act mandates a 10-year planning horizon. That's a big advantage for us, right? Because normally we have 1-year or 2-year budgeting cycles. We have presidential terms and turnover and congressional terms and turnover. Mandating by law a 10-year time horizon really gives us an opportunity to look out and to think ahead as we seek to implement the law and what it wants us to get after, which are roots of instability. Third, the law demands, and we are very excited about this piece, that implementation be led from the field. And what this does, what this attempts to do, is to mitigate what we call the 6,000-mile screwdriver from Washington. Now, Washington is mandated to provide, and we must provide, strategic guidance. But we understand that in so many ways, having our field, that would be in our case our embassies, where we have interagency collaboration, working with actors at the national and local levels, with civil society, with the private sector, and with others, will be a very important component of success in this implementation. We are also mandated, as Liz has described, to conduct the work in partnership with others who are present on the ground, our allies and our friends who contribute to work in countries that may be regions that may be selected under the law. And again, we do this, but do we do it as well as we should or we could? This is where the law can be very helpful in focusing our attention. And then finally, there is required a monitoring, evaluation, and learning agenda, which is designed to capture changes in the local and external context and inform decision-making. And it's mandated to be conducted at what we would call the strategic level, starting with the theory of change, and then to flow through the work that we're doing at the programmatic level. And the message here that we've received and are internalizing and are seeking to apply as we move forward with implementation is we not only need to learn the lessons, but we need to apply the lessons. So those are some of the elements of the law that I think we find very attractive, not only for the countries that we may focus on under the law, but also for our broader learning and application as to way the U.S. government can do, should do its business in other parts of the world as well.
Great, helpful overview. Appreciate that. So, Rob, your experience is very broad across many countries in your time at USAID. So where have you seen success, or what lessons have you drawn from some of your experiences in countries where there was a lot of instability? You've been in some conflict zones. Where have you seen the U.S. government get it right in working across agencies and being really effective for the communities that are being impacted by the violence and instability?
Well, thanks, Maura, very much. And it is great to be here. I was never very good at sports, so and my dad will be very proud when I said I was featured at Notre Dame at the stadium. So, as Anne alluded to, many of us are very familiar with the failures. But even in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of good work came out. A lot of good things happened. There are a lot of young girls and women that can read today that couldn't. So there are good things to pull from the past. And as USIP and the task force was looking at how we could do things better, a team from state, DOD, USAID, was working on what became the SAR, the Stabilization Assistance Review, which took a hard look at what we did right and what we did wrong for 2 decades. That fed into the creation of the Global Fragility Act and what we're talking about today. For people that are young, you might not know just how bad Liberia was for a long time. Sierra Leone was a failed state. We used to talk a lot about Waziristan as the hotbed of Al-Qaeda. No one or few people are going on vacation this year to Waziristan. But after 10, 15 hard years of working diligently, different parts of our government working together, things are a lot better there. good things happen. If you try to break it down, what worked in these places? Some of that is the Global Fragility Act is trying to force us to do it in more places. Go in, be humble. The American government has a hard time being humble. Listen to the people that live there. We have a hard time listening. And those of us in Washington, we need to listen to our pros out there in the field who are talking to the people who live in those countries. I usually think if the idea is generated in Washington, it is wrong until proven otherwise. And if the idea is generated in the field, it is going to be correct until proven otherwise. That sounds pretty basic and simple, but it's amazing how often we get people like us, who would think we'd ever do something wrong, get together in a White House meeting and start spitballing what should happen in a country, and before you know it, a cable goes out telling that ambassador, we've come up with this plan to do X, Y, and Z. And then 18 months later, we're like, why didn't that work? Because it was informed by a bunch of misinformed people who were spitballing and forgot to listen and be driven by, find the people who live there. But they're smart. Every country on earth, I don't care how desperate a situation is, every country on earth has valiant patriots who want to make it better. Find them and fund them. Get your strategy driven by their insight. Forget the idea that we always know more because we have so much experience at this stuff. As much experience as we have in a troubled country from X, Y, and Z is nothing compared to the people who live there every day and care more about it because it's their homes, it's their families, it's their communities. How do you put that into a policy? How do you put that into a law? That's what they've tried to do. The civil society groups and Congress that worked so hard to get the Global Fragility Act, they're trying to force us legally to execute on these lessons that we know is the way to do it, but we can't help ourselves sometimes making things more difficult. So that is our challenge. There's one other bit of the law that I love, which is Congress has mandated us to identify the problems that we've built for ourselves in the system and identify to them what do we need fixed to make our lives simpler. Because most of the government spends most of its time wrapping ourselves up and making things more difficult. We're trying to simplify things and make things better for a change.
So, Mr. Saenz, your experience in the Army, your extensive career in the Army, and in various roles at the Pentagon on counter-narcotics, counterterrorism, and in working and guiding installations, military installations around the world. So, in your mind, in these fragile areas, whether there's a humanitarian crisis or it's post-conflict, what is the best approach for the U.S. military to take? The Department of Defense, which has a lot of different departments and a lot of different roles around the globe.
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much for having us here today. I very much appreciate that. And I would just start by saying, Rob, I wish you were a little bit more passionate about this. But to your question about the Department of Defense and my experience on what is the appropriate role and appropriate place for defense in trying to develop stability within these different regions and different areas. So I would say that a lot of my experience was where we're talking about, which is on the ground. And on the ground, it was not that all the players weren't there working, right? It wasn't that one department or other was missing. It was that often we didn't realize what the other department was doing. And we didn't realize that we were doing it in the same exact geographical location. So I think what we're going to get out of the Global Fragility Act is what Ann and Rob have been speaking about. As we're driven to coordinate together and work together, we can get to a synchronization. So I believe that we have coordinated quite often throughout the years, but we never really synchronized our efforts to ensure that they were building upon each other, not working crossways or not going off in disparate directions, all well-meaning. I think the Department of Defense can certainly assist in that way because through our combatant commands, our geographical combatant commands, we have an ability to leverage some significant planning efforts to help make sure that everything is synchronized. That's one thing defense does pretty well, is plan. So we certainly want to make sure that we are able to help and assist in that way. And then when it comes to on the ground, we need to make sure that the Department of Defense does what it's best at, which is defense-like things, which is supporting the professionalization of militaries and security forces, helping develop an understanding of pure subordination to the rule of law, to civilian authorities, and to helping develop the capabilities necessary to provide security to the people. And then, of course, we're there to support other agencies' efforts with our extensive logistics and transportation, and in some cases, in some places, security that we can help and provide. So I think that it may not be as disjointed in the past, but there is that next step past collaboration, past coordination, and into synchronization.
Great. So to broaden out our conversation, we're going to bring in some other voices. We have an incredible group of policy experts and academics who are going to take the stage to contribute to the conversation in some flash talks on some topics related to the Global Fragility Act. So I will introduce all of them as they take the stage. So we have Mr. Paul Stairs. He is the General John W. Vesey Senior Fellow for Conflict Prevention and the Director of the Center for Preventative Action at the Council on Foreign Relations. And Annie Forsheimer. She is a Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's had an extensive career at the State Department in many of these environments that we're discussing today. We have Professor Lisa Shirk. She's the Richmond G. Starman Senior Professor of the Practice in Peace Studies here at the Keough School of Global Affairs. And Paul Turner, who's the President and Executive Director of Fund for Peace. And Josefina Echevarria Alvarez, the Associate Professor of the Practice here at the Keough School and the Director of the Peace Accords Matrix at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Errol Yabok, Director and Senior Fellow of the Project on Fragility and Mobility at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Ryan Shealy. He's the Director of Governance and Conflict Research at Mercy Corps. So this is a powerhouse. And we're going to get the input of each of these brilliant individuals with expertise in the topic of fragile states and conflict prevention. So we're going to start with you, Paul.
Okay. You think after sending me the seating plan, I would actually know where I'm supposed to sit, but it shows
You guys did a great job. You did a great job taking the stage and going to your assigned seats.
It felt a little bit like graduation.
I felt like I was definitely supposed to have diplomas. Oh my God.
I guess it helped.
Fragility is such a serious topic. Oh my goodness. Okay, Paul.
Okay, so the Global Fragility Act is clearly a very important event and real milestone in the development of, as my predecessors said, a sort of coordinated, all-of-government approach. My feeling is that when this was passed in 2019, we were in a different world. And today, as you know, anybody who's watching the news, you see talking heads talking about this is a pivotal moment, a hinge point in history, and we're obviously talking about Ukraine. And for once, I think the hyperbole is not exaggerated. I think we are now moving into a very different world. Maybe whether it's a new Cold War, it's certainly probably going to be a more ideologically opposite adversarial situation that we will have with Russia and China, economic decoupling, increased defense spending, a much more confrontational era than I think the era we've just come from. Now, for me, if the Global Fragility Act is still to be relevant and make a difference, we have to adapt to this new world. As Lisa Grand was saying, when it was conceived, it was very much about countering violent extremism, enhancing stabilization in weak and fragile states, and all important goals, and they're still important goals. But we can't kid ourselves in terms of what we were planning to do with the resources that Congress has given us for this huge endeavor. As you sent to us just before we came here today, the current appropriations bill for FY22, I think, has given, what was it, total 210 million? Guys, you can help me out, for 3 different funds related to the Global Fragility Act. 210 million. Now, that ain't a lot of money spread across, I think, 5 priority states. It's not nothing, but it's not a lot. Jim can tell me what was the total defense budget for FY22. What was it?
$782 billion.
782 billion?
Oh, yeah.
Billion with a B, right? So we're looking at 210 million. And so I don't think we should hold out a lot of hope, frankly, at that level of resources with the level of challenge that we face in the 5 countries that we understand will be chosen shortly to receive this money. It's not nothing, but it could be a lot more. And I frankly feel the only way we can increase the level of support for this important effort is to ensure that it's now aligned with the new priorities that the U.S. government and U.S. foreign policy will have in the post-Ukraine world. Otherwise, it will continue to be considered sort of marginal backwater of U.S. government effort. And so we have to align our priorities to what will now be front and center in U.S. foreign policy going forward. It's very much going to be countering Russian influence, Chinese influence, and dealing with other malign actors on the international stage. And so we do have to, I think, have that in mind if we are going to get more support. I'm not saying we should subordinate the original intentions of the GFA to this new era of great power competition. But if we don't, I think, it will just become increasingly marginalized within the U.S. government. And the same goes also with the structures that we build, the coordinating arrangements within the U.S. government. If they are standalone, if they are somehow, orphaned within the U.S. Foreign policy process, that also won't be good. So they have to be mainstreamed within, the decision-making that's now going to be taking place in the next weeks and months as we sort of move out of the situation in Ukraine. Otherwise, as I say, it will be marginalized. And I'm very much, I think, informed by the experience of the Atrocity Prevention Board. I don't know whether many of you know about that, but it was a very elaborate structure that was set up during the Obama administration, very well intentioned, but because it was never mainstreamed into U.S. foreign policy priorities, it was always marginalized. So I think it's very important that it be integrated. The third thing, and I'll be quiet, is that the choices we make when it comes to the Global Fragility Act, because the resources are so limited, they have to be able to leverage other funds among our international partners. We can't go to places and try to do amazing things with the levels of funding that we have been given now. We have to work in places that are going to attract additional funds, whether it's from the World Bank, the European Union. There's a whole range of actors. And if we don't, again, I don't think we can hope to achieve much. So we either be pure and poverty-stricken, or we'll be relevant and rich. So that's my basic line. Thank you.
So I guess I'll start off since you called us out on the budget there, Paul.
Nothing personal.
You can afford it.
So I could not agree with you more, and I think that we do have an opportunity to align our new strategies with what we want to do in the Global Fragility Act. So now, as we're working on developing our new national security strategy, which should be out soon, and our underlying national defense strategy, which should also be out soon, we start talking about things like integrated deterrence and competition below the level of conflict when we talk about our competitors, China, Russia, and to some extent Iran, North Korea, and VEOs, which are still a concern. As we look to compete against them in what we call the gray zone, we will look for opportunities to push back or to take away opportunities from our competitors. So if we look at where there's instability, those are opportunities for people with ulterior motives to execute some malign activities. Normally we think about part of my other mission set, which is transnational organized crime, but also our competitors also try and leverage opportunities within those undergoverned spaces. So we can align those places we choose to do stability as either pushing back what maligned activities are currently occurring, or taking away the space before they get there to try and take advantage of those people and those cultures. When it comes to the resourcing, I think you're absolutely right. So $200 million doesn't seem like a lot. I would first say that I think that that $200 million is Congress's way of saying, prove to us, D3, 3D, that you can do this, and then down the road we should be able to get some additional funding as we're able to prove that we're able to work together and find some quick wins. Certainly, the Department of Defense, as we do our part of stability operations, will still rely on the same fundings that we've always relied on before this $200 million. So the $200 million, these two can fight over. So that's like, to your point, right? Trying to leverage additional funds that we already have available to those activities we do that align underneath the Global Fragility Act. And then you're absolutely right. We're going to have to make sure, and it's part of what we talked about really already about the Global Fragility Act. We want to make sure that we are aligning our activities with other allies and partner nations. We want to make sure we're aligning our activities with the private sector and NGOs, and so that we are not only just trying to use everyone else's resources, but we're leveraging all those resources to the same set of goals and objectives.
Anne, and then I'm going to bring in Annie after. Did you have a comment?
Yes, I did. So just demonstrating our whole of government approach, I want to align myself with with what Jim said. And to respond to a couple of points that you made, Paul, I think one could make the reverse argument, as Jim has alluded to, that we find ourselves in whatever this environment is as it's evolving, where activities under the Global Fragility Act are more important than ever to create the kind of resilience in states around the world where we are focused that is necessary to achieve these other objectives in what is an evolving, certainly an evolving security environment, and in ways that thus continue to align to our broader strategic objectives. The second point I want to make is, yes, it would be terrific if there was more money, new money associated with the law. However, the law is very clear that implementation under the Global Fragility Act is not just about this new money. It is about aligning our activities across the government and leveraging the tools that we have from the tools that we have to invest, Defense Department, security cooperation and assistance, and all the kinds of capacity building that we may be doing pursuant to other agencies or other agencies working through the State Department and USAID in places. And that alignment is a very core component of what we are attempting to do. So yes, the money sends a signal, but we are not just talking about the new the new funds. And then finally, on the mainstreaming point, yes, Paul, some of us were also part of participated in the Atrocity Prevention Board, and I think took some important lessons away from that. And you are right that we are mindful of this, that we do need a process that is not siloed to the functionality of the GFA, but that is integrated across the work that is being done with a regional lead in the U.S. government.
You want to weigh in on the?
Yeah.
Paul, you started off by saying that in 2019, when the first task force was looking at these questions, and then when Congress started to take them up, it was a different environment than now. And I'd like to pick up on a point that both Jim made and that you made to highlight the difference. One of the core foundations of the Global Fragility Act is that the country where we will be engaging in this whole of government aligned approach has to accept it. One of the differences between then and now is the reemergence of non-alignment as a principle of engagement. What does that look like? A country says, no, thank you. You take your $200 million and you go somewhere else because we're non-aligned. So this dynamic in international cooperation and politics has emerged in the last, and we've seen it very dramatically in just the last several weeks. There's another uncomfortable torque, and that is that, when you talk about competition between, let's say, China, which is in many of the countries where there's been a discussion about whether the Global Fragility Act will be implemented, China's there. China's got a model for dealing with fragility. It's resourced, very sympathetic to local interests, determined policy behind it. We may find ourselves in a situation where we're implementing our model and they're implementing theirs, and we have to be prepared for the possibility that they don't choose us, right? That other model wins. I mean, and this could be happening very quickly in some of the countries that might be announced. And that could be a real blow for us if we're not prepared to get our best model forward and our best foot forward, or prepared to explain why, over the longer term, ours is the one to bet on, not theirs. But I think that even in the first countries that come through the chute, this could be a problem that we face right away.
Fantastic. I'm going to bring in a few of our other discussants. Annie Forsheimer, if you could go next, and then Josefina, if you could follow her, and then we'll go back to the panel for responses.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thanks for this opportunity and to be with some really wonderful colleagues. I'm going to take a slice of, Maura asked me to speak about bureaucratic sludge. So I'm going to take a look as a former practitioner who served in many of the countries that could fit the definitions and on some of these issues. I'll point out that there are two basic bureaucratic mindset issues that you might want some help on. We're all happy to help with it. These are confusion and opposition. So on the level of confusion, this could be seen, and often is, as one more strategy among many. Any given country is part of a regional strategy. I worked in Central America, let's say, so there's a Central American engagement strategy, but there's also trafficking in persons, women, peace and security, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, there's countering China, there's climate change, there's business promotion. You, at an embassy, have to take all of those strategies and figure out, are they actually nested one within the other? Are they in competition? Which one is bigger than the others? Under which do the others fit? And when you do budgeting, Congress adds to this through earmarks, so you could find the same amount of money mysteriously solving, the water earmark plus agriculture plus countering violent extremism, because you built a well in a specific place. And so how is it that the Global Fragility Act can become a sort of overarching and coordinating strategy? you're going to need those difficult choices to be made, not always in the field. I mean, just one very tangible example, trafficking in person, also a law, with statutory punishment for countries that don't meet the standard. So when you have a country that is accused justifiably of having a really bad trafficking in persons problem, all assistance is supposed to be cut off. But what does that do to your 10-year planning and your coherence of your strategy? So the people who believe in the trafficking in persons strategy believe pretty strongly, and so they're not usually dissuaded by an argument that that's going to cut off other important work. In other words, what is the way in which the bureaucracy can get a clear message about the importance and overarching nature of the Global Fragility Act? And I think that, unfortunately, is going to be essential if you can have a long-term effect. The second issue is agencies have different agendas, and so I wouldn't call it opposition out of anything other than a need to pursue those agendas. But I have experience of watching security, law enforcement, other agencies have a strong desire to work with security forces, which others would describe as predatory and human rights violators. And that is a tension which sometimes even bubbles up to the level of the public posture. And there you have an example where a non-program activity, like an ill-considered remark by a senior visiting official, can undo the program good that has been done. And if the US government messaging isn't fully coordinated, this agency over here pursuing its agenda is going to undo the work of other agencies. In general, only the White House has the true ability to, cut through, make the choices, and tell agencies that they have to get on board to some version of a greater good. And I know it can work. It has worked usually perhaps for short and specific pushes. I had the good fortune to work early in my career in South Africa at the end of apartheid, and watching the US government work in an incredibly concerted way to pursue the messages that were part of the successful transition there. I've also seen the longer term effects of some of the democracy promotion or human rights promotion activities that we've pursued in other parts of the world. It can work and it can be concerted. But again, what you need is some very, very positive messaging from the White House about the importance of the strategy and the fact that some other strategies may not get all that they want if this one is going to be pursued.
Great. And Josefina, who, as I said when I introduced her, is the director of the Peace Accords Matrix here at the Keough School, and has some lessons from that incredible work, particularly in Colombia, that might inform the implementation of the Global Fragility Act. So,
Thank you,
Josefina.
Maura. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I've had the opportunity to speak to some of you before, and I'm very grateful for this 3 to 5 minutes flash talk. I will be very disciplined. My name is Josefina Chavarria, and I'm the director of the Peace Accords Matrix. This is an applied research program that we have at the Kroc Institute at the Keough School. Basically, what we do is we look at the implementation of peace accords that have been signed between governments and illegal arms organizations around since 1989. We have 34 of those peace accords in our matrix, and this is a database that is the longest and most comprehensive database that exists about peace accord implementation. So we have, at the moment, 34 of those comprehensive peace accords, which seek to not only stop violence, but to create the conditions for sustainable peace building and stabilization. And what we try to do is to learn from implementation about the design of the accords, and to learn from implementation also in order for us to be able to advise in a substantive way negotiators and conflict parties who are interested in ending the wars and building sustainable peace building in order to share lessons that we think can be applicable to other contexts. So one of the things that we do is to really try to, when we face a challenge, when we face a complex problem, not only analyze the problem in and of itself, but look at other comparable experiences of other countries that we do in a very intuitive way, but try to do this in a very systematic way. So this is what we have since 2012. Looking at these 30-plus peace accords, I think we've learned a big deal. We're a big team of researchers, practitioners, managers, very experienced peace builders. But in Colombia, we have a very special role because for a few decades now, the University of Notre Dame has had an important presence in peace building through the Catholic Peace Building Network, through educational partnerships, and supporting communities that had been affected by violence. And when the peace negotiations started between 2012 and 2016 in Havana, Cuba, between the government and the FARC guerrillas, the university was able to sign a memorandum of understanding and provide substantial advice about the design of the peace accord that was being, negotiated, debated, discussed, and had a few crises. And that particular advice, I think, was very relevant and important to make this peace accord in Colombia almost like a model peace accords in many ways. It is very comprehensive, but it also has incredible features such as a gender approach. So this is the first peace accord around the world where you're not only looking at provisions within the accord that speak about women's rights, but you really have a gender approach mainstream there. Through our research, we were also able to come to the conclusion that one, if not the most significant factor in implementing a peace accord is to have a third party monitoring the implementation of the accord. This is transparent information. This is giving everyone involved equal access to information, and it's as simple as creating an objective, factual, evidence-based source of information where we can not only coordinate but also hopefully synchronize implementation decisions. We were lucky enough to be named in the 6th chapter of the Accord as the official monitors of implementation. We've been there already for 5 years, but our commitment is always 10 years. So for us to think about 10 years is the minimum commitment we have, which is we look at 10 years after signing the peace accord. We created a specific methodology that allows us to monitor the implementation of the commitments. And this methodology, of course, is born out of research from other cases, but a lot of the coding rules and a lot of the specificities of the methodology was agreed upon with local stakeholders and, of course, with the local government. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of PAM in Colombia, which is it has a mandate that is included in the accord. We developed, tailored this methodology with the local government and local stakeholders, which has allowed us to have a lot of legitimacy with them, but also to influence the governance structures that have been created and designed for the implementation of the accord. And finally, because we have a large team of people in the field, we don't only use information that comes from one source or government, information databases, but we're able to triangulate the information. So we have direct relationships with more than 300 organizations, national and international, and the information that we put into our database is really based on checking and validating what we call the progress of the implementation event. The success that we have had in Colombia, I think, comes from, again, this combination of technical knowledge with being available, being on the ground, growing these relationships, taking care of these relationships, understanding that our work is a technical work, but it's always embedded within a larger political discussion. And our independence and our reputation really also comes from being committed and being engaged. So we are independent monitors, but we do care that this actually works. We care that this is actually a significant contribution to peace building, not only in the next 10 years, but hopefully in the next 50 years.
So, Rob, with that kind of example of the intense monitoring over 10 years after a peace accord, to see the progress, which can be very incremental in a place such as Colombia, how does the 10-year planning for the Global Fragility Act, which could be implemented in places far less stable than Colombia that may not have a peace accord, and still you need to have something to measure against in looking at a 10-year plan. Is there any discussion about having a written agreement somehow between the U.S. government and maybe not just the local government, but different key actors, something to measure the progress of the country plans against with some independent monitoring? Is that being discussed?
Well, I'm glad that Josefina, you highlighted Colombia, because we want to find a country where there's a lot of good lessons to pull, both on how this work is implemented, but how we as a government got things right, not always, but got things right a lot of the time. Colombia is rich with lessons. 10 years, as Anne alluded to, is a gift to be able to be allowed and mandated to come up with a 10-year strategy. Strategic patience is not one of the things we're very good at, and often we're called upon to make a big difference in a very complex environment, you name the country, within 6 months. 10 years is far more realistic than the 21-year plans we had for Afghanistan that didn't necessarily string together very well. And yes, we're looking at what does it mean to work with the government in a country, whether it's called a compact or not. How do we get agreement on what we're going to do together, what their role is, what our role is? A lot of us have a lot of work on what that looks like. And I think it's got to look different in different places. We need some guidelines. We need some part of the reason to have the 5 priority countries or regions is to try different things and then to maybe try something that doesn't work over here. If it's working over here, don't stick with a bad plan if you're learning what's going on over here. I'd like to get back to some points that Paul made, though. You're right, it's not a lot of money. And it's got to be relevant. And some of us share our good friend Liz Hume with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, who was a powerhouse behind this whole thing. She often points out, when they were first trying to put this bill together, there were no priority countries. This was for every country on earth. And then some people said, look, we have a hard time figuring out what to do in 1 country or 2 countries. Let's just start with 5. But if you look what Liz said, you summed it up pretty well. Basically what this act is, strip out all the fancy words and mandates and stuff. It's how do we do better as a government at these things? It's really about a culture change. But no one wants to say that because it's so hard to have a culture change. But the world just shifted. We don't know where it's going to end, but it shifted. When is there a better time to have a culture change? And if we've established that this is the way we want the government to work in 5 countries, why can't we hyperspeed it and go, let's get serious right now and work together and not wait for those 5 countries? Why don't we come together and work? Now, as Annie said, there are God knows how many strategies out there. And I'm not so naive to say what we need is a grand strategy for them all. But we do. And what is it like a world crisis and a war in Europe to have some focus, ladies and gentlemen? Let's focus. And the Global Fragility Act just moved from The Economist somewhere in the back to the front page of USA Today. This is relevant if we allow ourselves to be relevant. But if we make the mistake of saying we have a little project to work on these 5 countries and try to get it right over here while everyone else is working with tectonic plates that have shifted, the end of the post-Cold World era. We don't know what this era is going to be, but it gives us an opportunity to try to get it right and not wait another 20 years and look at the lessons learned.
Jim, Ann, both of you want to jump in?
I just wanted to follow on what Josefina had to say, because the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, which I now lead, has been funding this project for 5 years. I think we're the primary funder of the project, or one of them, and we're very proud of that. What you heard her say, you heard the innovation in the way that the project is leading its work. You heard a little bit about what the project is doing and what's important about working on the ground level, gathering data, analyzing data, and creating transparency that is publicly available for others to see around progress in implementing the accords. And that's very powerful. We're very proud to be associated with the project. And the reason I want to come back to that is not only to note that relationship, but to say, as we move forward with the Global Fragility Act, where are there lessons that we can take from the kind of work that's being done through the Peace Accord monitoring project and apply them elsewhere? Because we in government are going to need the help of our partners outside of government as we move forward. So thank you, Josefina. And Annie, what can I say? Words of wisdom. Words of wisdom. And
Beware of multiple strategies.
yeah.
So I'll take it from there. So in some ways, it's a good thing to have a bunch of strategies, right? Because it means that topic was important enough to us to develop some detailed plans about how we would like to try and tackle that problem. To Rob's point, though, wouldn't it be nice to have some sort of grand strategy that brings that all together so that we don't have such a challenge with figuring out what we're going to resource and what we might not be able to resource as much as we like to? And I think the Global Fragility Act can be that grand strategy. I think that we will take the opportunity to look at those other efforts that we have going on, see how they feed into developing stability in any one area that we're working in, and then have that, the overarching strategy that pulls in all those other strategies and all those other efforts as we need them. And I just want to also comment on your other very good point about the fact that, so we have, rightfully, we are ruled by our values and mores and beliefs, as it should be. And so then we have come up with some legislation, some rules that say, well, if this organization or this country is not following appropriately or violating some of those ideas, we don't want to work with them at all. And I can certainly understand why we got to that point. But I think that's something that we need to think about some more. Because if we're not there, that is a gap. That is providing space to that other model to come on in. Mm-hmm. And while that other model may claim to be there for good reasons, they are not. They don't care about trafficking in humans. They don't care about illicit drugs. They don't care about illicit weapons. They care about having access in order to, I think, stealing that region's resources is not too powerful. So we don't want to get pressed out because we don't have an opportunity because we decided we don't want to take that opportunity. We want to get there first, fastest, hopefully with a better plan. And I'll just close by saying that I think we will have opportunities where when we don't win that race, eventually the people will figure out that this other nation doesn't really have my best interests and needs. Maybe I need to switch plans.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch to our Keough School colleague, Lisa Shirk, to bring in her experience from working at the local level. There's a lot of talk in the U.S. government, appropriately so, about more local engagement with all of these types of initiatives. And Lisa has extensive experience working with civil society. Ryan does as well with Mercy Corps. So I think it's good to bring in the civil society local engagement perspective.
Thank you. It's great to be here today. being on the stage today, often with people that I've shared the stage with a number of times over the last 20 years, talking about this pattern ever since 9/11, and we started saying this actually in the month after September 11. We started saying the big threat in the world is not from the big states, it's from the fragile states. And that's where the generation for focusing on violent extremism and trying to move in this direction, and here we are almost 20 years later, 21 years later, saying, well, we were wrong. There is still a threat from big states, but also there are a number of other things that have come to light, and that is that the fragility that we thought was only in these other small states is actually within our own. It's not just Afghanistan that has a problem with violent extremism. We have a problem with violent extremism here in the United States. And actually, my students in strategic peacebuilding, a master's degree level class that I teach here, they brought this up. I see her shaking her head. That, why are we talking about U.S. foreign policy and fragility when the U.S. is fragile? I think what we're learning also is that there's a movement of populism in the world today and sort of an anti-government. And we're in a much clearer lens of wanting to decolonize or be in a post-colonial critique of sort of foreign powers coming in. So there's a number of trends that I think really impact this conversation today. I want to touch on, Rob Jenkins, you talked about listening as really key. And I think listening is just as important for the Global Fragility Act as it is for our own government here, thinking about Iowa or Mississippi or any of the states, because it's the same basic challenge. How is the government going to relate to people? And then how is a foreign government going to relate within a system of a generation of new civil society organizations? Because over the last 30, 40 years, there has been a boom of civil society organizing itself, institutionalizing, moving from protest in the street to actually having concrete policy recommendations and really formalizing itself with thousands of new civil society organizations. And these aren't just international NGOs like the beloved Mercy Corps I'm sharing the same stages with, but local NGOs that I've worked closely with in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm going to start by just talking about what does listening to local voices mean. 3 quick points, 3 quick case studies. I worked in Afghanistan quite a bit over the last decade. And my job was really to try to work at civil-military coordinations, but also with local civil society. Because while the big international NGOs had a liaison with the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, those international NGOs did not know the local NGOs, who had master's degree, PhDs in transitional justice, peacebuilding, conflict transformation, really important skill sets that were needed to address the conflict in Afghanistan. And when I would go into the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, nobody knew of these small NGOs, these Afghan NGOs who had been mediating tribal conflicts literally for 3 decades. They had skilled mediation networks across the country. Afghanistan has one of the most vibrant civil societies anywhere, and yet it was almost completely invisible and untapped. And so I would go to the Pentagon. I gave speeches there about, hey, we have to find a way of listening and learning and sort of being more in tune with all the local capacity. Because all we were talking about in Washington and even at the UN is the lack of local capacity. There's sort of, this sort of idea that nothing was out there. It was only sort of corrupt government and the Taliban and then victims. And there was sort of this invisible category of capable civil society who really wanted a government that was able to work with them. So in terms of thinking about what does local ownership and local consulting or working with for the U.S. government in fragile countries, it means getting outside of the city. So, it's not just a few Afghan men who should be consulted. It's across the gender diversity, men and women, youth, and also within the provinces. We have to get out of the capital cities. we also have to think about the different ethnic groups. In Afghanistan, many of the NGOs were divided by, there were Pashtun NGOs and Tajik NGOs, and we needed to be able to connect with all of them and to know the difference, that we can't just invite a couple of NGOs in because they represent different interests. They're also doing different types of work. There are NGOs focused on human rights advocacy, others on mediation, other NGOs that were working on women's empowerment. So there's these kind of different varieties of civil society that need to be having a liaison with the US government. So I'm going to jump from that sort of thinking about the diversity of types of civil society groups that are on the ground to thinking about the different ways the US government can liaison with them. And I'm going to jump to the Philippines for the case study here. These case studies are coming out of a 3-year project funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Funds with 30 different case studies of civil-military coordination, which was really looking at whole-of-society coordination. So it was looking at how the government's military security forces was interacting with civil society, looking at what were the best practices. And it was a cooperative arrangement between the Alliance for Peacebuilding and the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict and the Kroc Institute between 2013 and 2015. So in the Philippines, they have had a lot of really interesting experiments that are now formalized in coordinating, and it began with the military and the Philippine military coming to peacebuilding institutes, actually run by Catholics in Mindanao, to get training in negotiation. And out of that, develop these personal relationships between the security forces in the Philippines and the peace builders. And so the capacity building led to doing joint conflict analysis of where were there security issues in the Philippines. It led to actually the government of the Philippines giving security access, intelligence access to certain civil society actors who then were privy to some of the information the government had on where rebels were organizing or where kidnappings had happened. And civil society could be the first resort to try to negotiate the release of captives before there would be a military raid. So it was a way of sort of trying to de-escalate, and civil society was in partnership with the Philippine government working on these sort of human security issues. Finally, I want to jump to Kenya, which really gets to the different levels of local ownership. So in Kenya, there has been the formation of a National Peace Council. Again, it's the government, the security forces, civil society, and the UN is also working there, so that there is sort of not just an information sharing between the government, but that civil society are in active partnership with the security forces, identifying where there are security threats developing. When a riot starts breaking out, there's apps, technology that assisted, it's called Ushahidi, where people can report immediately, and there is a first resort of a mediation team who can be deployed to go try to de-escalate, and then there can also be calling in the police when local mediators say it's beyond our capacity. So these are just a few of the examples that came out of the report. I'd love to talk more about how local ownership can be improved. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think your students are here.
I think they're going to get some better grades for that beautiful support of their professor. Any response, or we can move on to Ryan. I think it would be a nice segue to Ryan from Mercy Corps. If you could jump in, I think it builds off nicely from Lisa's comments.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to zoom in on one specific aspect of conflict prevention and local ownership, and that's strengthening social cohesion. So the Global Fragility Strategy emphasizes that weak social cohesion is an important underlying driver of violent conflict, and that enhancing cohesion is vital to building resilience to complex shocks and stresses. Despite this shared recognition of the importance of strengthening social cohesion, this is easier said than done. Efforts to design policies and programs to build social cohesion have been hampered by a lack of consensus or clarity about basic definitions and approaches. Just as an example, when the World Bank asked Mercy Corps to build a measurement toolkit for social cohesion in 2019, we found that researchers and implementers have used over 2,600 different survey questions to try to measure this concept. So this is certainly a daunting barrier to engaging with social cohesion in a concrete and practical way. And it's really logical to want to just run away or avoid it. However, there's a growing body of experience and evidence that points to a new approach to building social cohesion that has some important lessons for Global Fragility Act implementation. At its simplest, social cohesion can be defined as the ability of communities to collaborate with one another and with their government for the common good. At Mercy Corps, we operationalize this by focusing on 6 measurable dimensions: trust, belonging, shared identity, attitudes towards other groups, collective action norms, and civic engagement. Each of these dimensions can be measured both horizontally, so within and between groups, and vertically, between citizens and the state. Using this approach, we've learned a lot about which specific dimensions of social cohesion play the most important role in reducing the likelihood of violent conflict. In particular, our evidence indicates that trust, shared identity, and belonging are strongly associated with reduced risk of violence. In addition, the link between these dimensions is not just limited to relationships between identity groups. It also applies to these vertical state-society relationships. Across a number of different contexts, greater trust in state security forces and in leaders is associated with reduced support for violence, as is a sense that one's ethnic group is treated fairly by the government. This set of findings indicates that in order to strengthen social cohesion in the service of preventing violent conflict, it'll be necessary to carefully layer and sequence peace-building interventions that address weaknesses in social cohesion between groups with complementary efforts that repair state-society relationships, focusing on good governance and rebuilding state capacity and trustworthiness. And this type of multi-sectoral layering of efforts is vital to strengthening social cohesion. Doing this effectively is going to hinge on one of the broader goals of the Global Fragility Act, and one that the panelists and fellow discussants have mentioned throughout the conversation today, and that's deep, ongoing coordination across security assistance, diplomacy, and development programs. Each of these types of engagement have different roles to play with respect to building cohesion between groups and between state and society. So the risks of not getting this coordination right are interventions that only partially transform and disrupt the pathways connecting weak cohesion to violent conflict, which increases the risk that interventions are ineffective or have unintended consequences. So what does this mean in practice? First, interventions should be designed using an evidence-driven approach that identifies the specific dimensions of social cohesion that need to be strengthened in order to prevent conflict in a given context, and which tracks progress on these dimensions over time and over that long 10-year stretch of time. As a result, we recommend against using a single index that boils this down into one dimension, and instead focus on disaggregating social cohesion indicators at the level of these underlying dimensions. This also means a need to invest in data visualization and analytic tools that can serve as an effective dashboard for strategic planning, M&E, and ongoing learning and adaptation. Second, this process of collaboration needs to deeply include meaningful participation by local communities, civil society organizations, governments, and the private sector, right? This is exactly what we've been hearing. And this local participation is broadly relevant to the Global Fragility Act, but it's particularly vital for strengthening social cohesion. Our growing body of evidence shows that well-facilitated participatory planning approaches are effective at strengthening key dimensions of cohesion, especially trust, which is fundamental. Our evidence also shows the importance of investing in strategies and interventions that overcome specific barriers to meaningful participation by marginalized groups, especially women and young people. And finally, to wrap up, these two lessons about building social cohesion speak to a bigger question of how academia and the research community more broadly can support Global Fragility Act implementation, right? It's been a question we've been asked again and again throughout the day. So to meet the Global Fragility Act's broader goals around evidence-driven learning and adaptation, we recommend building a diverse multi-actor research network or consortium. Such a network would entail strategic partnerships between the key departments and agencies and a broad set of US-based and local researchers and knowledge producers within academia and civil society. Constructing this kind of broad and inclusive research network will help to build a robust evidence base on the causes of violent conflict, and the effectiveness of policies and interventions across contexts, which in turn will help to make good on this tremendous promise of the Global Fragility Act as a new approach to preventing conflict and addressing the drivers of fragility. Thanks.
Thank you. So can the U.S. government, is it possible to receive evidence-based research from Mercy Corps, from academics like Lisa Shirk, others, the work that Alliance for Peacebuilding, so many others, Center for Strategic International Studies, CFR, there's so many incredible, brilliant studies and analyses, evidence-based research on so many dimensions of the Global Fragility Act, how to engage the local community, how to measure and evaluate success. Is there even a mechanism to absorb all of that within your agencies so that it can be truly brought into the conversations in the room about these 5 countries, this plan? Is there a way that it connects, or is it just too much out there to absorb? And then I'll go next.
The answer is yes.
Good answer, good answer.
So Lee's and the USIP every year bring scholars to Washington, D.C. To help them figure out how can they make their research and what they're producing more relevant in this policy realm. Unlike today, where Washington has come to South Bend, it's when South Bend comes to Washington. And Lisa's team is nice enough and kind enough to have me speak to them every year. And my message is pretty simple. We want to know what you're coming up with, but you've got to dumb it down enough that I can pass it on at a meeting in a sentence or 2.
Ouch.
I mean, it's sad.
What did Jim say, a bullet point?
Ouch, she said.
Oh, ouch.
I need facts that I can throw on the table during a meeting without having to caveat it and footnote it and use words that I have to look up on Google before I go into the meeting. It sounds like I'm not being serious, but I am. There's so much amazing research out there that some people in my building are reading, but it doesn't even get to me because I don't have the time. It's 25 pages. I need someone to give me the bluff. Bottom line up front, what do we know? If I get a question in the room and they say, how do you know that? I can say, because I just got this on the plane to South Bend, Indiana. I read Ryan's new report on social cohesion. It's 10 very easy to remember and understand things that says, here's how we know how this works. The question I get asked most often about countering violent extremism, about stabilization, about peace building is the same. Every boss I've had for the last 5 years has said the same thing. How do we know it works?
Right. That's right.
We know it works. There's a body of knowledge on this. Well, can someone just break it down for me so I could give it in an email? And we have that, but we need it. So I'm not saying we're anti-intellectual. I'm saying, but that is just that's the way the bureaucracy works. We have lots of smart people, but help them break it down for us so we can get it to the tables where the policies are being made. Otherwise, you're going to get what we usually have, which is policy by anecdote. You go, oh, that's like the time I was in Bosnia. And then suddenly we have something that looks like Bosnia.
Huh?
Anne?
Lisa, okay. Lisa and then Anne?
No, Anne.
Oh, Anne, then Lisa, sorry.
Yeah, so I would say what Rob has said is
trying to say it
true. Scott says true for senior policymakers. However, I also take what Ryan has said very seriously, and our monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes for the Global Fragility Act need a mechanism where we can engage with the kind of work, the great work that Mercy Corps and other organizations like Mercy Corps do every day, and understand it below the level of, with all due respect, to the 2 sentences that we might need for an IPC or a DC, because that we need to enrich our understanding of what is going on the ground, what works, what you know. And so I really appreciate what you've had to say today. Ryan? No.
on the issues of local ownership, Rob and Ann and I and many others have reflected on two very big problems confronting the Global Fragility Act before it even starts. Number one is the name.
Mm-hmm.
So I know everyone who's worked with countries that actually are fragile, the last thing that country wants to be called is fragile. So you're the Minister of Finance in a country where you can't get access to conditional funding, and you're trying to rebuild the grid so that you can deliver a public good to the most remote areas of the country. You just lost all access to that concessional funding the day that the U.S. government says you're fragile. All right, there's not going to be one country that's going to welcome being called fragile. Second fundamental issue within the Global Fragility Act is the disciplining mechanism, use your word of colonization, of a compact. These are disciplining mechanisms. If you don't do that, then this will happen to you. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about this. Rob and I have known each other for many years.
Sorry.
And in many countries where we were working together, this was a very big problem, because the construction of our partnership with that local government is just a new form of intrusive interaction that is highly difficult for that government to accept. Now, those of us who are tasked with supporting the implementation of the Fragility Act, we're very well aware of this. And it's under the leadership of Jim and Rob and Ann and others that we're going to have to address those. We know those problems are there. They are inescapable, and they could kill this initiative before it even gets started.
So I'm going to turn to Paul Turner and Errol Yabok to pick up on this, because this issue of how to measure the progress of the plans in each of the chosen countries for the Global Fragility Act gets to the heart of what Lise just brought up. Can the U.S. government, in these plans and in any possible compact or agreement with the countries, hold itself accountable? Can there be a transparent, what I've learned from some of my colleagues here at the Keough School, particularly at the Pulte Institute, who have expertise in monitoring and evaluation, they've taught me that for local communities, local actors, to have ownership in designing a monitoring and evaluation system and have it be transparent such that the U.S. government is having to own up to some commitments that are made to that community that it's working in. So it's a two-way street, but I'll defer to my experts on monitoring and evaluation. So Paul Turner with the Fund for Peace, if you could jump in, and then we'll go to Errol and then some final comments.
Thank you.
From the panel.
I think it's a really interesting challenge, and one that I've been all across the spectrum. The closer you get to the field, the more you want the freedom to not have any measures of success, because you want the flexibility to be able to do what you feel like is being called for at any given moment. And so there's a lot of real value there. But I think as a community of those working in foreign assistance, you've seen a significant evolution over the last few decades of what monitoring and evaluation means, where it's gone from being kind of a box-checking exercise to having something with a lot more rigor in it. And within that, there's also been a lot that's probably been driven by the work that took place in Iraq and Afghanistan and informed elsewhere, that's really tried to see how can we maintain that ability to be flexible while still being able to show at least incremental success. And I think that's the real challenge when you talk about measurement. I think it's completely reasonable, and as a taxpayer, I want my dollars going to an institution and agencies and departments that are going to be good stewards of those dollars, and asking of those that they are awarding grants and contracts to be able to show like what that progress looks like. But at the same time, when we look at the field, especially of conflict prevention and peace building, I found that the expectations there are much higher than you would find in terms of humanitarian response or in terms of security interventions. And I think that those questions should be posed to our legislators from those who are tasked with trying to take those things forward, and not to unleash an unrestricted and unmeasured initiative, but to really be able to help inform them as legislators as they're trying to consume the information that's coming up to them, and to basically bring the entire community along to a much more nuanced understanding of what's taking place. I love the opportunity, or I think somebody said the gift that the GFA is giving us with this 10-year time horizon. It shows that a lot of learning has taken place because there's been extensive criticism of trying to really show significant measures of progress in very limited time windows. I think that there's also so many tools, several of which have been discussed already today in this panel, that are available to the policymakers to be able to select from. I think one challenge that I've seen organizations, whether within the government or outside of the government, fall on their faces with is the incredible enthusiasm that exists around data. And what I mean by that is it's important to have the identification of the data that's needed to be able to measure success, to be able to have rigorous frameworks that data is being captured under. But if all you're left with is quantitative information without the ability to qualitatively interpret that and to help our senior leaders and policymakers with that one-sentence request that Rob referenced earlier, to be able to say, here's where we are at 100, and let me explain what 100 means in this context. It's very crucial to be able to help tell that story, whether it's of success or of our need to be able to adapt and change because we need to shift the interventions that we're involved in. I think the opportunity also with the whole of government approach that was discussed earlier is really exciting in some of the work that's been done with measurement over time. If you look in many places, there are indicators that are set up at really almost meta levels that feel almost disconnected from the work that's being done on any particular project or activity on the ground. And those sentinel indicators are a great opportunity to take that overarching whole of government strategy where the 3Ds and potentially even others can get on board to help drive the Global Fragility Act priorities forward in the country, but at the same time provide parameters to the different activities that you'll see on the ground. And so that implementing partner, whether it's a local organization or whether it's a local organization that's paired with an international organization, can have another set of indicators that are focused maybe at the subnational level or hopefully even closer to what's taking place in a particular community or village. And those indicators should be able to talk to each other but should look really different. And so I think we need to be able to think about measuring success not just at that meta level and not just at that, how's this village looking? Are the people feeling more secure and confident and invested in their community, invested in their government? But that all of those things are somewhat interdependent. I think also it's important when we're talking about contextualize what data is telling us. I've worked a little bit on elections, and there's some really uncomfortable data if you're looking at what takes place in elections in countries that tend to be receiving the fragile label. A lot of times you'll see increasing scary indicators. However, if you go back and look whenever the last election was, 4 years, 10 years ago, there may have been significant improvement since then. And it's important that we as a community are able to contextualize, hey, there are still some negative trends that are taking place in this environment, but our efforts in conflict prevention have shifted the dynamics so significantly on the ground that we're looking at a 60% drop since the last election, and we need to be able to give ourselves a pat on the back and to be able to learn from what those successes are, and hopefully in the next election in 5 years' time, maybe we can address that remaining 40%. I think the ability to learn isn't useful just in terms of an academic sense or to inform future activities, but to be able to really engage in the policy and programming cycle. And when we're talking about measures of success, those indicators have to be able to force the implementers, have to be able to force the policymakers to reflect and say, what is it that's happening here? Are we measuring the right things? And are we doing the right things? And that learning can help us pivot. Hopefully not a lot of that's needed, but unfortunately a lot of these environments are significantly transitioning, sometimes even from one year to the next. And if that's the case, certainly your activities will need to shift, and occasionally you may even need to go back to the drawing board to rework the things that you're measuring, because with significant shifts in the environment, for example, if we were to talk about what we're measuring in Ukraine a year ago versus today, that would be a very different conversation. And as a result, not only do your activities need to change, but also your indicators. And just to talk about one last thing before I wrap it up, and that is I think there's been some quick references to the value of a local approach or localization and the need to listen to the voices on the ground. And I think when we talk about measures of success, if we're only doing that as outsiders that are coming in and checking the temperature or looking at the tire gauge or whatever it may be, I think we're selling ourselves short of a real opportunity to develop partnerships and long-term relationships with those PhDs on the ground, with those long-term community activists that have been there and working to try and help understand what it is that we need to be monitoring, how we can actually go about identifying those measures of success, and then working with them to be able to evaluate what the story is telling us as we're looking at those indicators. And so hopefully the GFA can open the door for a more intentional effort to bring in local voices into that conversation. I think it helps us check the box and also really lean into a transformational approach to the way that we do foreign assistance that not only helps us address fragility, but also can even move us in the direction of addressing some of these other large challenges like the great powers competition. Because if ultimately we're trying to find a way to build alliances, what better way to do that than to collaborate and share an effort together? Thanks.
Thank you. So Errol, bring all the pieces together.
Wow, what a panel. I'm sort of rethinking, I do a lot of these events, and I'm sort of rethinking my rules against size of panels, because this was really, really interesting.
Yeah, we kind of blew those rules out of the...
Yeah, no, it's good. You do it differently here in the Midwest. Man, I'm also realizing that I'm standing between y'all and the weekend, so I'm going to try to bring Rob Jenkins levels of energy to my short presentation here. But I wanted to talk briefly about these 10-year plans that we've talked about, and specifically about the role of Congress, because we've sort of touched on it a little bit, but I think it's something that is really critical. Since we're amongst friends and off the record in this public event, nobody who's in government wakes up in the morning and says, man, I really want to go and report back what I'm doing to Congress. Yet it's such a critical part of this, and I think all that Paul was talking about in terms of the sort of learning that needs to be built in to not only the planning but the actual implementation, that's really critical that is communicated back to Congress in ways that are accessible to them, in ways that allow them to see that in these environments that we're talking about, sometimes it is one step forward, two steps back. And the government, and I will include the legislative and the federal branch in this, and the executive branch, we're not always good at risk. Visit Lebanon, go to the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon as a U.S. government employee, and you'll know what I mean. Beirut's one of the most beautiful countries in the world, and you can't see it. It's not just the physical sort of protection that is required, that risk. It's the risk of failure that is not really allowed as much. And I think the GFA is potentially revolutionary in its focus on this, of allowing space for, you can call it failure, you can call it learning, whatever it is, we need to use this as an opportunity to build our risk tolerance. as we move forward. And because I think what has happened in the past and what I don't want to happen with the GFA is sometimes you tell people what you think they want them to hear, lest you run the risk of not getting the funding you need next year or something like that. And I think that's a real shame. And I think the fact that we talk about $210 million appropriated this year, there is actually mandated funding for the 10 years. And so I think that gets to this point that the GFA offers some, okay, the amounts may fluctuate. Once you prove the model, you can go up, et cetera. But I do think that there's this sort of need to understand that some of this stuff is going to work and it's going to be great, and some of it's just not. The second and last thing I'll say is when I'm sure every U.S. government colleague who's writing these 10-year plans is listening to this great event right now as they sit in the 5 places that are like the worst kept secret in Washington. And I hope they're already writing those plans, because the turnaround time is going to have to be lightning for this, for the GFA. I'm sure they are. I'm sure friends and colleagues here have already silently tasked them to do that. I would encourage those folks who are writing those plans to think about this not just as what do we know from what works, but think about it. Paul Stairs started our conversation in the discussion section talking about the world has changed. Since 2019, the world has changed since February 24th, 2022. Let's think about, let's use the tools of foresight, for example. Not forecasting, not crystal balls. We don't know what 10 years from now is going to look like. But use the tools of forecasting, foresight, which talks about, let's actually figure out what some of the various scenarios could be. What could these countries look like in the future across the spectrum of what those possibilities are? And then figure out in our planning what we can do to try to put those countries and our engagement in those countries on the path to the scenario that we think, together with them, is the best or the most advantageous. Again, that's not trying to predict the future in your plan, but it's trying to figure out what we can do now that puts us on a path to success, whatever that success looks like. Checks, notes, make sure you covered everything. Back over to you, Lauren.
Excellent. If there's any student with a burning question before the weekend, we could take one question, but it is still St. Patrick's Day celebrations here on campus. But it looks like we have one of our excellent graduate students, Maggie Kmetz. All right.
It's on. Okay, great. Hi, thank you for being here with us. It's great to meet you all. It's been wonderful to hear your experiences and your perspectives on these complex challenges. So as Mara mentioned, my name is Maggie. I am a second-year Master of Global Affairs student in the Policy and Governance track, specialized in gender justice, human rights, and humanitarian assistance. So the MGA program is incredibly global, as the name suggests. In its 5 or so years, the MGA program has attracted students from over 70 countries with incredibly diverse backgrounds, experiences, and professional interests. So it's great to see so many women on this panel, 3 of which are Notre Dame professors, so that's awesome. But as we talk about U.S. action abroad, and as we think about the U.S.'s role, particularly the government's role under GFA, and as this panel looks, as you all look to your left and to your right, I wonder how the U.S. government, and perhaps even this panel specifically, can work to be a bit more representative of U.S. Identities and demographics that are notably absent from this conversation. And so then, Mr. Jenkins, you were talking about the importance of local voices, the importance of listening, and I wonder how you reconcile doing the good work that you do, hoping to continue to do that work while these voices are absent. So, thank you.
I'll start.
If you want to start, sure.
So last fall, Samantha Power, the administrator of USAID, went to Georgetown. Sorry, it's Catholic, but a different place. And laid out her vision for her administration of USAID. And a big part of that was a dedication and a revalidation and dedication of all of our agency's work to localization. And I don't think there's anything that we're talking about here that is possible if it's not absolutely rooted in the local context. I don't mean in the capital, as others have said. What works in the capital does not necessarily, take Colombia. You got to take a plane and get in a boat for 8 more hours before you get someplace. That is where these things have to be rooted. Those are the people we need to listen to. So this, at its very nature, if you're talking about trying to prevent conflict, if you're talking about building peace, which is not something the U.S. government talks about a lot, and now we're in the peace building business. That's what we want to do. That means finding people where they are, who they are. Those are the people we need to be listening to. And institutionally, I think I can speak for all of my government colleagues. We are not going to be happy with the U.S. government's makeup until we have a government that looks like the United States of America. We have a long way to go. This administration has gone a long way in 1 year, but it's slow, hard slog, trying to get through you talked about bureaucratic sludge. There's a whole bunch of things that we have put in place over the years to try to be fair that actually stand in the way of us trying to reach out to communities that are underserved, underrepresented, and bring them in. So give us some time, keep up the pressure, because government does not do anything without pressure. Hold us accountable, make us be transparent. All this stuff about programming we want to be, co-design, we need to do that internally as part of the representatives of not just your government, but of you and the American people. Thanks.
And one thing, when Maggie and her classmates were in Washington last week and had a chance to interact with USAID, World Bank professionals, and some NGO leaders, I think we were all inspired to hear that the U.S. government in the field is trying to hire people from those countries, hire local leaders, local civil society individuals to help implement programs so that it's not all Americans going abroad. But that effort seemed to be, from what we heard at least, very proactive, considered effort. So hopefully a lot of the international students who are here at the Keough School now, if they so choose, back in their home countries, may want to partner with the U.S. government in some capacity or another to be partners in some of these efforts and therefore help make them successful. So hopefully we will all be seeing a lot of those changes, and we'll give Anne the final word.
Sorry, I can't help myself, because our Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, is extremely committed when we talk about the U.S. government piece to advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And I can tell you, as someone who entered the government a very long time ago, for the first time, more than 30 years ago, as Rob said, we still have so far to go. And we who serve know that. We understand the importance of our agencies, as we have just said, looking like this country. If we are going to be more effective in carrying out our policies, more effective in carrying out our policies and our programs overseas. And I just want to assure, especially the students here, that we have been charged as leaders in the Department of State to carry out these commitments. So I want to encourage you, those of you who are from the U.S., who can come to work in the U.S. government, that it is still an incredible, incredible opportunity and an honor to be there. And we, all of us who are leaders, who are paving the way for the next generation, really want to do our part to bring you in, to be inclusive, and to ensure that we have the best possible talent among us representing the U.S. government. Thank you.
Great. And at next year's conference, we will have our representatives from some of these fragile countries that will have been selected. There will have been implementation, and hopefully Dean Appleby will have the budget to fly in some experts from some of these venues. Do you want the final word, Jim?
Final word. Wow, that's a lot of pressure.
No,
You know, I just have to pile on, not because the others said it, but because this is very important, and I personally am very passionate about it. The United States government, and especially the United States military, must reflect the face of America. Now, this administration has said that they are going to work on that, and we are working on that. Certainly, Secretary of Defense Austin is behind trying to make sure that we're working very hard on our diversity, equity, and inclusion. But as we've said, it's taken us a very long time, and we've said this for many, many, many years. So maybe like the Global Fragility Act, where we need help from the outside helping us figure out how to do that, maybe we need help from outside to figure out how to do that, right? But we will not give up. We will continue to press, and we must look like America. So if you need a job or you want to put on a uniform, come let me know. Do not stop pressuring us. You got to keep pressuring us, no matter whose administration is in the seat at the time.
Great. Well, thank you all. We'll keep the conversation going with some additional discussions here with faculty and students. But our public panel is ending, and thank you all for contributing so much to this conversation.